to empower you. What a nasty night out there. I applaud all of you for coming. If I didn't have to be here, I'm not sure I would have. But anyway, I'm Betty Overstreet, the Executive Director. This is Veterans Day, so I'd like to start off with the Pledge of Allegiance, if you'd please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Since it's Veterans Day, I do want to give some recognition to the day and what it is. I'm going to start off with just a history of Veterans Day, and then I'm going to go through and cover a little bit on the wars that have occurred in this country since the beginning of the United States. Veterans Day, formerly known as Armistice Day, was originally set as a U.S. legal holiday to honor the end of World War I, which officially took place on November 11th, 1918. In legislation that was passed in 1938, November 11th was dedicated to the cause of world peace and to be hereafter celebrated and known as Armistice Day. As such, this new legal holiday honored World War I veterans. In 1954, after having been through both World War II and the Korean War, the 83rd U.S. Congress, at the urging of the Veterans Service Organization, amended the Act of 1838 by striking out the word armistice and inserting the word veterans. With the approval of this legislation on June 1st, 1954, November 11th became a day to honor American veterans of all wars. As you all know, later on, they took some of our holidays, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Columbus Day, and they put them all on Mondays. Well, that didn't go over too well with some on Veterans Day. So eventually, finally on September 20th, 1975, President Gerald Ford signed a law which returned the annual observation of Veterans Day to its original date of November 11th, beginning in 1978. Since then, Veterans has been a holiday on November 11th, and that's where we are today. The U.S. military came about on June 14th, 1775, during the American Revolution, with our first formal fighting force, the Continental Army. The Revolution was fought from 1775 to 1783, with George Washington in command. There were many important battles during the Revolution that would shape our nation and the military. The war began with a shot heard around the world at the battles of Lexington and Concord. With the conclusion of the war and the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America won its independence from Great Britain. A more formal military force was put in place at the time of the Mexican-American War. The Army increased to over 30,000 soldiers with about 60,000 volunteer troops. The U.S. forces landed in Veracruz in March of 1847, leading to the capture of Mexico City 6 months later. In February 1948, the U.S. and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, marking the end of the war. After Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election, Southern states began declaring their secession from the country. The Civil War began in April 1861, when Fort Sumter was attacked by the Confederate Army. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln made ending slavery a goal of war with the Emancipation Proclamation. The war hit a turning point in 1863 at the Battle of the Gettysburg, and on April 9th, 1865, General Lee surrendered to General Grant at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. This effectively ended the war, abolished slavery, and granted civil rights to freed slaves. After the Civil War came the Spanish-American War, World War I, that became known as the Great War. And on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched an attack on Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii. With the devastating attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declares war on Japan and its allies, Germany and Italy. The US Navy and Japanese Navy would have another engagement at the Battle of Midway, ending with a US victory, which became a turning point for the Allies and stopped further expansion into the Pacific for Japan. In Europe, Prime Minister Mussolini's government collapses, and on September 3rd, the Italian government surrenders to the Allies. On June 6, 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower and the Allies launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The beach landing on Normandy is one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. The invasion took place on 5 beaches with 156,000 troops. The landing on Omaha Beach resulted in 2,400 casualties. Along with the beach landings, 13,000 paratroopers were dropping behind enemy lines to break German supply lines and secure key areas for the Allies. With the Germans being driven out of northwestern France and Paris, the Allied forces claimed victory in Normandy. The Battle of the Bulge lasts for 6 weeks, causing over 100,000 casualties for the US Army. However, the Allied front, alongside the 101st Airborne Division, claims victory of the battle on January 25th, 1945. Nazi Germany surrenders on May 8th, 1945. As the war unfolds in Europe, US Marines make an amphibious landing at Iwo Jima on February 19th, 1945. Just 4 days into the battle, Mount Suribachi is taken by US Marines. With the capture of Iwo Jima, American forces moved their focus to the island of Okinawa. On April 1st, 1945, US troops land on the beaches of Okinawa with little resistance. Wanting to end the war, President Harry Truman dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, with a second bomb being dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. World War II came to an end on August 14, 1945. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan signed its formal surrender, marking VJ Day and the official end of the war. World War II has ended, only to bring about the Cold War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The US involvement in the Vietnam War is limited until August 1964, when North Vietnamese boats attacked the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. In March of 1965, US troops enter Vietnam. Over the next year, the US continues to increase the number of troops in the region. After many battles, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Minh began the Tet Offensive in January 1968. The Tet Offensive marks the turning point in the war and begins the gradual withdrawal of US troops from Vietnam. With promises of ending the draft and restoring peace, Richard Nixon takes the presidency in November 1968. In January 1973, US troops withdrew from Vietnam and POWs were released with an agreement was reached effectively ending the war for the US occurring on April 1975. Wars continue with Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War, and then, not since the Civil War that was fought on American soil, war is declared on American soil once more with the event of September 11th, 2001, sending shockwaves across the United States. After the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon, President George W. Bush announces the War on Terror. After the War on Terror is declared comes Operation Neptune Spear, the taking of Osama bin Laden. In February 2020, the US and Taliban reached an agreement and signed a peace deal. This agreement required the US to leave Afghanistan within 14 months, and this brings us to the present day. As the US begins withdrawing troops, the Taliban quickly begins taking areas of the country and regaining rule of Afghanistan. The last US troops departed Kabul on August 30th, 2021, ending nearly 20 years in Afghanistan in America's longest war. America lost 13 more soldiers and many others wounded, some severely at the end of this war, angering many Americans, veterans included. There are some of us today who only know about the wars prior to World War II because of those who have recorded history and taught it. For many serving in the military today, they only know about the wars prior to 9/11 because of those who have recorded it and taught it. Today, our educational system wants to replace history with nonsensical rubbish and with claims that the Holocaust never happened. At the end of World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sent communications to both Washington and London, urging the two governments to send instantly to Germany a random group of newspaper editors and representative groups from the national legislatures. He felt that the evidence should be immediately placed before the American and British public in a fashion that would leave no room for cynical doubt. Philosopher George Santana is credited with saying, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Since the Revolutionary War, Americans have willingly served our country in peacetime as well as wartime. Our veterans have always served for freedom, to make America a better place, and for those in other countries, a better life. I often wonder what our veterans feel when they see some of the things that are happening in America today. Not things they serve their country for, I'm sure. Today, I want to thank our veterans for serving and to say to them, in spite of some of the current day's events, you have made a difference for America. You've made a difference in lives in other countries, and you're still making a difference. Thank you for your service. Are there any veterans here this evening? If they are, I'd like for you to stand. We have 2, 3, 4. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you. Betty Overstreet is our great executive director. Could we give her a round of applause? Thank you for that, Betty. That was so nice. We've got 2 giveaways we're going to give tonight, and they're both from our guest author, David Mowery. The first one we're going to give away for people in the studio is his newest book, Cincinnati and the Civil War, that he'll be talking about tonight. So get your ticket out, and let's pick a lucky number. That number is 858. Number 858. Oh, see, you did get a chance to do that. Your name again, sir? Oh, Jeff is the winner of the book. Let's give him a round of applause. He's already got one, but so how do I do that? We'll do that. And then for all those online tonight, thanks for joining us. We're so glad to have you. Will be this other, the other book David talked about, I guess a year or 2 ago, David, and it's called Morgan's Great Raid. Just to show you how crazy things are sometimes in Glendale. I live in this cool town, Glendale, Ohio. It's a historic town just up the street. And just to show you how woke things have gotten, about a year ago, a woman came in to city council there. My friend Horowitz will appreciate this. They were asking me how Glendale was, and this woman came in, and there was a plaque about Morgan's Raid in the square in Glendale, right by where you drive through, for those of you who've been to Glendale. And this woman went on this whole rant about it had to be a racist raid, and the plaque had to be removed. And I don't know if you knew about that, David, but that's how it goes. At the end, when you leave tonight, this is important. We had somebody in last session to talk about the backpack bill, which is a great kind of, it's a great kind of educational freedom bill. Nita Thomas will pass this out to you. If you can grab one, it'd be greatly appreciated. Just a few things I wanted to go over. Tonight's class is sponsored by our great treasurer, Bill Roll, in the back. Could you give him a round of applause for me? And we're glad to have Jay Grunke producing tonight. Let's give Jay a round of applause. So I think I've told you our friend, other than buying David's books at the end, one is 25 and one is 20. Our friend Vivek Ramaswamy dropped off, I think, 20 books. I think we've maybe got 14 left now that are signed. And his inscription, I really dig it. You may see this later. It says, "Speak freely." I think it's a really good message. So I think we've got these on the way out if you're interested after you buy David's book. And then just a couple other things, a little house cleaning. So our last class we had scheduled with Professor Al Tufarber got canceled because we don't know why he canceled, but we also were going to have a candidate for Governor, Jim Renacci, here to talk to us about a big announcement he had. And the professor just decided to cancel on Betty and I. And truthfully, I don't know why he canceled, and he wouldn't tell us why he canceled, but he kind of did it in a little bit of a huff. And I just wanted to clarify why we have candidates come in here, because I had somebody write me a note kind of saying, you know, you're a Jim Renacci fan. My goal in these classes is that you'll never know who I'm a fan of. The only reason we have candidates come here is for you to get an opportunity to meet important people that could have something to say over your future. So when we have Joe Blystone here next Tuesday, he's a candidate for governor. I mean, Betty, yeah, you like him too. Okay, well, somebody likes him. But Betty and I don't have any agenda for, at least I don't know, maybe Betty does. I don't have an agenda for who these candidates are. And the reason that we're bringing them here is so you can evaluate them for yourself and see if you like them. And that's it. That's it. That's the only agenda that we have. So Tuesday night, our board member, Karen Cartier, will be speaking about made to last, made in the USA items. I think it's going to be a fun class. I know she's worked super hard on it. And then Joe Blystone will be here to talk to you about his vision of Ohio. Our last class of the semester will be next Thursday night, a week from tonight, at a great new brewery on Chester Road called Third Eye Brewing. And it'll be a great way for us to end our 22nd semester. And it's $12 for a taste and a tour and some appetizers. And Betty and I would love to end the semester with you there. It will be a really fun night. And Third Eye is going to treat us very, very well. Betty, I don't know, for some of you who were here, I gave Betty a present of some beer and told her she needed to practice her beer drinking. And we're going to find out that night if she's, how she's done and if she's ready to go. So the last thing I wanted to tell you is several of you have been sending me ideas for classes for next semester. Now's the time. If you've got one, info@EmpowerUAmerica.org. Send me your ideas. We keep them in a file, and then we get together in January, go through them all. And hopefully we'll have another great semester, our 23rd, which will be starting at the end of February. We're so glad to have David Mowery here tonight because his class last time he was here was just so great, and so many of you enjoyed it. He's a native resident of Cincinnati, Ohio, and a graduate of the University of Cincinnati. American military history piqued his interest at an early age. Since childhood, he's researched and visited over 700 battlefields across 50 states and 9 countries. In 2001, David joined the all-volunteer Civil War Trail Commission as the Hamilton County representative. But over the years, his role expanded to include the final design and historical validation of the entire length of the John Hunt Morgan Heritage Trail of Ohio. He's a co-author of Morgan's Raid Across Ohio, the Civil War Guidebook of the John Hunt Morgan Heritage Trail. And since 1995, David has been a member of the Cincinnati Civil War Roundtable, for which he has written various papers on the Civil War subjects and has led many Civil War tours of the Cincinnati region. He's also served with the Buffington Island Battlefield Preservation Foundation, the grassroots organization working to preserve Ohio's largest Civil War battlefield. David Mowery, welcome to Empower You. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you very much for having me back. And first of all, I'd like to tell all the veterans here, thank you for your service, and all those online that are watching as well, but especially those who never came back. Having studied military history all my life, practically, one thing you learn really quick is what sacrifice is all about when you study war. And freedom is never free. What we have today is because of our veterans all the way back to the 1600s. So thank you for all that you guys do. And I dedicate this presentation to you guys tonight. So tonight's presentation, this is my debut of this. I've written a book about this subject that took me 3 years to write and research, mostly research time, not writing. I've lived all my life in Cincinnati. And the more I researched, the more I got to learn the city and how much it impacted the Civil War. And I hope tonight what you get from it is that impact. The fact that Cincinnati won the Civil War in the West. It was the city that changed American history. You wouldn't think that today, but hopefully after tonight, it will change your mind. While we're doing this is a very visual presentation. I didn't want you to get bored with lots of facts and figures. So what I've done is I've done a comparative study of original prints or photographs that were taken during the time of the war, that were created during the war or soon thereafter. And then I have a modern photograph, not exactly, but as close as possible to where the artist stood when they made that particular artistry work. So here's one right on the front page here, one of the great photos showing Union troops leaving Cincinnati over to Covington, crossing the very first bridge ever in Cincinnati across the Ohio River, the pontoon bridge that was built in September of 1862. And you can see the pylons here, right there, the starting pylons of the Roebling Suspension Bridge, because the Roebling Suspension Bridge was left incomplete when the war began because most of its workers went to war. And so when those soldiers crossed that pontoon bridge, they were looking at a bridge that would soon become the icon of the city. And that's what we see down here in the modern photograph down here. But I hope you get the sense of what Cincinnati looked like in the civil, and prior to the Civil War or during the Civil War, as well as what it looks like today. Before we can talk about Cincinnati and the war, we have to think about what was Cincinnati's role with relation to slavery, because slavery was the cause of the war, no doubt about it. There's a lot of debate. Was the Civil War a question of states' rights? Was it a question of United States over states? Yes, to all those questions. But what led to the war itself? Well, all those factors came from one source, what I call the explosion that caused it all, was slavery. And Cincinnati was certainly on the edge of what we would call today the slavery question. Because Cincinnati sat on the Ohio River, which was a border between slavery and free. But Cincinnati was not quite what you would consider a free state, a free city, or a free part of a free state. Yes, it was free in terms slavery was prohibited by in fact, it was prohibited since 1787 when the Northwest Territory was formed. But the fact is that Cincinnati and Ohio in general was very much either indifferent to slavery or was actually pro-slavery. And not many Cincinnatians know that. It's a hard thing to discuss sometimes, the fact that Cincinnatians were very much a pro-slavery city. Now, in fact, if you read certain books, like Nikki Taylor's book, Frontiers of Freedom, where she does a very sophisticated view of Cincinnati and the question of slavery, she says that Cincinnati was northern in its geography, it was southern in its economics and politics, and it was western in its commercial aspirations. That's a quote directly out of her book. The fact is Cincinnati had multiple personality disorder. It didn't know what it belonged to. And when the Civil War erupted on April 12th, 1861, no one knew, really, seriously, no one knew in the South or the North where Cincinnati would go. Would it go with the North? Would it go with the South? Would it get split? And it all started back in the 1830s, though, where things started to change in Cincinnati. Before 1830, Cincinnati was definitely a pro-slavery city. Kentucky, its neighbor, was a slave state. It did a lot of business with Kentuckians. So Cincinnatians had to tolerate slavery. Not only that, it had to respect slave owners because they were the big buyers. You don't take your customers and tell them in their face that they're wrong, right? You have to accept your buyers. So the fact is, economics drove a lot of the decisions in Cincinnati, as it has in every war we've ever fought in America. Economics is always at the heart of every war. Lane Seminary was formed in the 1830s. In fact, it was chartered in 1829, about the time that Cincinnati was becoming refined. Before the 1820s, Cincinnati was a Western town. It was what you would consider a gunslinger town, rough and ready. But in the 1820s, as refinement started to roll into the city's history, you start to see New Englanders moving in. New Englanders were very abolitionist. They were anti-slavery. And one of them was Dr. Lyman Beecher, who helped form the temperance movement in the United States. His daughter was Harriet Beecher. And of course, she would marry a Stowe, Calvin Stowe, become Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, Lyman Beecher was the first president of Lane Seminary, and Lane Seminary is very famous in the abolitionist movement for being the host to the Lane Seminary debates in 1834, which led to the change in intellectual thought in America from colonization of escaped slaves, or even those that would be emancipated, and send them back to Africa as a colony in Africa. Change that thought to abolitionism, which is eradicating slavery in the United States and making Native African Americans equal and have equal rights within the United States. That seminary today is a Cadillac dealership in Walnut Hills. In fact, the original buildings were torn down in the gosh, I guess it would have been the 1920s. And the back parking lot of the Cadillac dealership is that location. There's a historic marker there today along Gilbert Avenue. We have other famous abolitionists moving into the area that were well known. One of them was Salmon P Chase, and this is where he went to church, St. Paul's Episcopal Church on 4th Street, East 4th Street today, downtown. Salmon P Chase is very famous. He not only was an abolitionist and led in the abolitionist movement in Ohio, he was a longtime Cincinnatian. He moved here in 1830, and he became known throughout the country as the Attorney General of runaway slaves. He's a very vocal anti-slavery advocate. He was a well-read, well-practiced lawyer in Cincinnati. So he made his name defending escaped enslaved people, and also defending those who helped them, the Underground Railroad conductors who were found out, who were captured, or who were accused. Because of that knowledge, he started forming, or helped form, the various parties in our politics that were anti-slavery, particularly the Liberty, Free Soil parties, and our modern Republican Party. So you can blame Salmon P Chase for the Republican Party, of course. Whether you love the Republican Party or not, you can blame him to be one of the founders. But what's more important is when he was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, he had to fund the United States forces to defeat the Confederacy. An amazing task, a hard task, very difficult task, almost impossible, because our treasury was not very big at the time. And to fund the millions of men that end up fighting in the Civil War was a huge task, but he was able to do it. He was a brilliant man, and he was what we call the financier of the Union in the Civil War. He founded the IRS. Yes, when you file your federal income tax, thank Salmon P Chase. He founded the federal income tax to help fund the war. He also founded our greenbacks, our green money that we have in our billfolds today was started with Mr. Chase. It was the first federalized money that we had at the time. Most of our money was bank-based or state-based before the Civil War. He made federal money, and that money just made our lives a lot better, believe me. If you crossed the border, you didn't have to exchange money. That was in 1862 when he started the greenbacks. And all the Confederate troops wanted greenbacks because they had much more buying power than their Confederate scrip. So in battle, they would take off of soldiers that were dying or wounded, they would take their money, and greenbacks were really valuable throughout the United States. He also coined the phrase, "In God we trust," which has been under fire lately. Salmon P Chase was the one that came up with that phrase. He's also the first to open the US bond market to the public. Before then, it was really restricted to only certain buyers. And eventually became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the Reconstruction. He made a major impact on the United States and Supreme Court law, specifically for the freedom and equality of African Americans. So this man had a major impact on the United States history, and very few people know about him. We also have a lot of religion in Cincinnati that is interesting to follow, because religion had political backing back then. If you were a Protestant, you had a certain political agenda. If you were a Catholic, you had a certain political agenda, and you usually follow your religion with regard to politics. St. Peter and James Catholic Cathedral downtown is a Catholic cathedral. It's been around since 1845. Today, it is the oldest Catholic cathedral west of the Appalachian Mountains, Allegheny Mountains. Thank you. Yeah, there's a different one. The 221-foot steeple that was built in 1845 was the tallest structure in Cincinnati at the time. And 3 days after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, our Catholic Archbishop of the Cincinnati region and most of Ohio, John Purcell, he was so politically charged for the Republican Party and for the support of the Union that he had a giant American flag attached to the very top of that steeple so that everybody in the city could see it. It became so well known to soldiers who left the city and who came back that they always looked for that flag as a source of inspiration. So John Purcell was very much a pro-unionist, and all the Irish in Cincinnati followed him, and they became pro-unionist because of him. And this is the way it looks today. Hasn't changed one bit. Except the carriage down there has changed. If you look at the carriage, it's now I don't know what that car is, but it looks pretty nice. Different carriage today. So we know the Civil War begins on April 12th. You heard that earlier tonight. 3 days later, President Abraham Lincoln calls out the volunteers, 75,000 of them, to put down the Confederacy and the rebellion. Now, I told you that Cincinnati itself and everyone in the United States didn't know where Cincinnati would go. But it turned out Cincinnati was very pro-unionist. Deep down, even though they supported a lot of the slavery movement over the years, it was because they had to work with pro-slavery people. Most of our city's economics were Southern based. So to destroy that in any way was going to ruin the economic base for Cincinnati. But when the war broke out and the South seceded, Cincinnatians, to the 98th percent of the civilian population, believed that that was wrong, that ultimately the salvation of the Union was primary goal. And so when Lincoln asked for volunteers to put down the rebellion, there was no question. Cincinnati became a pro-union city immediately. It had been highly democratic up to that point in politics, and Democrats were pro-slavery generally up to that point. There was a certain faction of the Democratic Party that was not, but most Democrats were pro-slavery, or at least believed in tolerance of slavery, but they went Republican. Very interesting change almost overnight in the thinking of Cincinnatians. In fact, by April 18th, 3 days after Lincoln called out those volunteers, almost 7,000 men had joined the Union Army. through the Cincinnati Home Guard. That's 7,000 out of 30,000 that would volunteer in the state of Ohio. That's a pretty large number. What you're looking at here is a sketch that was made by a famous sketch artist, Henry Lovey. He made it down at Walnut Street and Fifth Street at the US Bank Tower. That's the Fifth Street market on the right. His sketch turned into a lithograph, which is what you see here. Very beautifully colored. And this is what it looks like today. You might recognize it as Fountain Square or the extension of Fountain Square. Right to my right off the side of the picture is the Dunkin' Donuts at Fountain Square. So with all these thousands of troops joining, they needed leadership. They immediately set up headquarters at this location. It was rented, this was a house before the war. It was rented by the US Quartermaster Department, who was responsible for setting up headquarters throughout the United States. It was originally, the house was built in 1832. It served as the local Union headquarters from 1861 through the rest of the war, but specifically from 1863 to 1864, it was the military commander of the District of Ohio's headquarters. That's important because Cincinnati became the command post for the Department of the Ohio, which was a multiple set of states that were incorporated into a department. Cincinnati became its headquarters and was placed here. District of Ohio is just the state of Ohio as part of that department. But the District of Ohio was a very important part of that department. Today, it's the Western Southern Life Garage down near the Red Stadium. You might park there when you go see the Reds. That is Arch Street coming out from the left. Right here, that's Arch Street. And this is Sycamore right here. I'm sorry, Broadway. My apologies. So what do we have in terms of defenses? What do we have in terms of defenses of Cincinnati? Well, we started out with Fort Washington, which was placed exactly where that Western and Southern Life Garage was. That fell apart. And by 1804, the United States needed something to replace Fort Washington. So they built Newport Barracks across the river from Cincinnati. It was located at the mouth of the Licking River in Newport. It was actually built by the US government, one of the first funded military installations from the new US government after the Revolutionary War. And General James Taylor was given that money he was the founder of Newport, by the way. General James Taylor was given that money to help build this fort, and he did that successfully. It wasn't really a fort, though. It was just a barracks. In fact, it was originally called the Arsenal. It was meant to hold arms and gunpowder and such. And it had various barracks to hold the soldiers who would guard it. It was completed in 1804. It served the US Army during 3 major wars, through the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War. It was closed in November of 1894 when General Philip Sheridan, who was then commander-in-chief of the Union forces at the time, US forces, he decided that Newport Barracks had worn out to the point where it was not worth keeping it there anymore. So he moved it over to what we know today is the fort. Well, it was not even a fort, it was more of a barracks too, over in Kentucky, farther east, Fort Thomas. Yes, he built that Fort Thomas as a way of replacing Newport Barracks. So today, Newport Barracks looks like this. And that is General James Taylor Park at the mouth of the Licking River. And then we also see the new Ovation development coming up there. That's going to be a big residential area here shortly, unfortunately. They found a lot of buttons there when they were building this structure, a lot of buttons from the War of 1812 and Civil War. So a lot of relics have been found. Well, to house these these soldiers, Newport Barracks was not big enough to house the thousands of Union soldiers being recruited. So they needed to have a camp to hold them. And this was their first camp, Camp Harrison. It was a little too small though. It only had 60 acres of land. Well, they thought that would be big enough. 60 acres was big enough to hold the US Agricultural Fair. Why not thousands of soldiers? Well, they ended up having 3,500 soldiers billeted there in the short time it was a camp. But the problem was it was too close to Cincinnati. It was only 6 miles away. And the fact is that the Civil War was an oddity to civilians, and their boys and their fathers and grandsons, they were all going to war. And this was a big deal. Everybody thought the war would be over in a few days, a few months at the most. So they considered this a great event. And so the civilians went out in thousands by omnibus, by carriage, by even just walking the 6 miles out to Camp Harrison. And they made a picnic out of it to watch their soldier boys out there learning how to be soldiers. So one day on April 28th, it was a Sunday, the railroad trains ran out there because it was the camp actually sat on the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad, which is the railroad that goes through Glendale. And they brought thousands of these civilians out there. There were 30,000 civilians out there watching 3,500 men train. Now that was a massive difference in numbers between civilians and soldiers. That was too much for the commanders. The leader said, this is a huge distraction. We got to get these people out of here. Well, there you can see, and even in the sketch there, they show these women. You see women and civilian men wandering through the camp. What a distraction. So General William Lytle, who established the camp, was happy that he put it there initially, but then he regretted it. And his commander decided it was going to change. Now look at this etching that was made. Now look what it looks like today. It's the Coolant Control Company on Spring Grove Avenue and the CXX June Street Rail Yard. That's what it is today. Now, the commander-in-chief of Ohio Militia Forces was selected to be Major General George B. McClellan, probably one of the most famous generals of the Civil War, mainly because of his blundering, but also because of his commander of the Army of Potomac, and Robert E. Lee kicked his butt multiple times. He's also the commander at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. But before he got that reputation, he earned a great reputation as being commander of Ohio Militia with headquarters in Cincinnati. He became commander on April 24th, and he selected his staff, and one of those staff members was Colonel William S. Rosecrans, his aide-de-camp. Rosecrans would also become a major general and a leader of the Union Army, the Army of the Cumberland during the Civil War. Well, McClellan ordered Rosecrans, we need to find a new place for a camp. Find one for me, please. And Rosecrans was an excellent engineer. He was an inventor, so he knew what to do. He went searching, and he found a great plot of land, about 700 to 800 acres that the state of Ohio could rent from the civilian. Where he found it? He found it outside what is today Miamiville. It was called Miamiville back then, but back then, Camp Dennison did not exist. It was known as Germany, Ohio. It was a little German-founded town that they had named Germany, not to be confused with the country, but it was named Germany, Ohio. And that little village became the center of what would be called Camp Dennison after the first governor of Ohio during the Civil War, Governor William Dennison. Now, McClellan purposely named it after William Dennison because William Dennison was the man who gave McClellan his job. And he wanted to give Dennison a note of thanks for making him a major general and commander of all of Ohio forces. Now, soldiers are immediately moved out of Camp Harrison over to Camp Dennison. These are some of the great Cincinnati regiments that we're familiar with, like the 5th Ohio Infantry, the 6th Ohio Infantry, 9th Ohio Infantry, the 10th Ohio Infantry. These are the early war infantry units that would go and fight most of the battles of the Civil War up to about 1864. These are great regiments that Cincinnati has a lot to be proud of. A lot of them just served for 3 months thinking the war would be over soon, but they ended up re-enlisting at Camp Dennison for 3 years after they realized that the war would not last in just a few months. They needed to be there for a long period of time. And several of those soldiers decided, no, I was not going to join. I didn't realize how hard it was to be a soldier. So they didn't re-enlist for 3 years, much to their dismay and much to their families' honor that they lost by not rejoining the Union Army. But most of them did rejoin for 3 years, and a lot of them did it here at Camp Dennison. This is an actual photograph that was taken in June of 1861, only about a month after the camp had been put there. And it's a great photograph. If you look at it, that photograph was converted into a lithograph, which you see here. And now here's the modern photograph. It's a gravel pit lake. It's called Grand Valley Preserve. It's owned by the village by Indian Hill, and it's in Sims Township area, very close to Miamiville. And here's another view of the camp. You can see the huts on the far distance there at the bottom of the hill. You see the Little Miami Railroad running through that. The Little Miami Railroad today is the Loveland Bike Trail. So if you like to take the Loveland Bike Trail, that is that railroad right there. You also see over here a big barn. This is a hospital. The very first hospital at Camp Dennison was put inside John Kugler's barn. John Kugler was the owner of what we know today as the Waldschmidt House, which is a museum that you can go to today that honors the region, and it also has a Civil War museum you can visit. It was the largest camp in the state of Ohio during the war. It was also one of the largest camps in the entire United States during the war. It also had one of the largest hospitals during the war. It was established during the Battle of Shiloh. It had 2,300 beds, which is a very large hospital at that time, at least amongst permanent hospitals. And then eventually the camp actually had 220 buildings to its name, 100 of which served that hospital. And over the course of the war, between 50,000 and 75,000 men stopped there, at least for a day. That's a massive number of men coming through one camp. It was truly the camp that Ohioans built. Ohio regiments came through there all the time, either to be formed, to be trained, or to be hospitalized, or to be discharged. It was used for all the different purposes that camps were used for in those days. One time during a very telling point in the summer of 1863, there was a massive outbreak of typhoid, and it affected thousands of troops around the Cincinnati area. 2,900 were on August 27th, 1863, were housed in Camp Dennison. That was the largest single number of soldiers that were present at the hospital at any one given time. But there were men throughout the war being hospitalized there since 1862. This is the way it looks today. You can see the bike trail and the fields that Indian Hill has preserved for their horse riders. It's wonderful. Looks like it did back then in the 1860s. And then there's the Kugler Mill soccer fields here that some of our youngsters might have played on recently. Now, when there's a massive outbreak of something like measles, that's very deadly to a lot of soldiers who had never experienced that. There was this mixture of city boys and farmer boys coming together, and the city boys had immunity to most of the diseases. Group immunity, sounds familiar? Well, they had the group immunity in the city, but they didn't have the group immunity on the farms. So when these two mixed, the poor farm boys got the worst of it. And a lot of them broke out measles in 1861. And so they needed help. The surgeons of the regiments weren't skilled enough yet. A lot of them weren't even present yet. They were coming in from the various cities around the state of Ohio. So they needed help. So they called upon General McClellan, who said, we can get some civilians to help us out. And McClellan and the local fathers of the city called upon a very interesting group of women, the Sisters of Charity. And they went to this hospital they set up. And that hospital, of course, is the Kugler barn I mentioned before, which was rented out from John Kugler. And that's where it is today on the left. And that interesting group of women was led by Sister Anthony O'Connell, an Irish woman by birth, came to the city to lead the orphanage, the German orphanage on the west side of Cincinnati. And she was a firm believer that care of the soldiers was of utmost importance, especially in her line of duty, being a person of the cloth. So she brought her fellow nurses there, and they nursed these soldiers to health. And what began in 1861 at Camp Dennison was the beginning of our field hospital system in the military. And you can thank the women of Cincinnati, these women particularly, to start that. In fact, she became so famous that the soldiers called her the angel of the battlefield. And they used to visit her grave over in Mount St. Joe. And for years on end, they would come every year and decorate her grave. Soldiers loved her so much. That was just a sign of how much they appreciated these women and what they did for them and how they saved their lives. This is the site of where, when they were at Camp Dennison, they had no place to stay. So they stayed in an abandoned Methodist church that's sat today where the soccer fields are across from the Walchman House. Now, there were other camps besides Camp Harrison and Camp Dennison. In fact, there were at least 5 or 6 different camps just in the Cincinnati area. And then there are several camps in northern Kentucky. This is one of them, Camp Clay. It was named after Henry Clay, the great statesman from Kentucky. When the Civil War broke out, Kentucky was declared neutral by its governor and its legislature, which meant that neither the South nor the North could recruit in that state. They couldn't create camps in the state of Kentucky. They couldn't do anything with their supplies in the state. They couldn't cross the state with troops. All of it was prohibited. And so any Kentuckians who were fervent in their beliefs of whether to join the Confederacy or the Union had to join their respective regiments in a different state, like Tennessee or Missouri or Indiana, in this case, Ohio. The very first 2 Union regiments that came out of Kentucky that were infantry regiments were the 1st Kentucky U.S. Infantry and the 2nd Kentucky U.S. Infantry, and they both formed at Camp Clay. Camp Clay is located in, at that time was the outskirts of Cincinnati, the 17th Ward, which is on the bend of the river just east of Cincinnati. And it was formed there strictly to bring in these Kentucky recruits. And sure enough, they formed these 2 regiments. And a lot of them were Cincinnatians who joined these 2 regiments. They weren't mostly Kentuckians. Actually, both of these Kentucky regiments were Cincinnati regiments. After they left and went to Camp Dennison, they were soon replaced by the 5th Ohio Cav. The 5th Ohio Cavalry was mostly Cincinnati Cavalry Regiment, and it came there in November of '61 to rendezvous essentially and start training. They didn't like the name Camp Clay, so they renamed it Camp Dick Corwine after their commander, and they soon left too. Today it's Duke Energy. It's on Riverside. It's on Riverside Road, where the Duke Energy facility is on Riverside Road, just east of downtown. I think it's just south of Hyde. It's on the river just south of Hyde Park. It's on the river just south of Hyde Park. The public boat landing was a very important place during the war. As you can imagine, Cincinnati was a huge city. I'll tell you more about its statistics. It was a huge manufacturing city as well. So everything that was going to be needed for supplying the Union Army had to go through the public landing for the most part. Some of it was sent by railroad, but most of it was sent by steamboats. And it was considered one of the busiest steamboat ports in the entire nation during the Civil War. Here you see the 1st Ohio Cavalry boarding for going to the south or being deployed to the front. Many soldiers, thousands of soldiers got on steamboats here at the public landing. And this happened on December 10th, 1861. They're boarding 5 different steamboats. That whole cavalry regiment had to go on to 5 different steamboats because they had to load themselves, the soldiers, they had to load their supplies, and they had to load their horses, plus any other things they needed like wagons and such. So that's why there's so many steamboats taking just one regiment of about 1,000 troops down to the south. This is an interesting building. It's the Spencer House, which was one of the most important hotels in all of Cincinnati at the time. If you couldn't afford the best hotel in town, which was the Burnett House, you went to the Spencer. That was the next best place. It's like between going to Omni Netherland versus the Westin or something like that. But the Spencer House hosted many famous people over its years, including Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Andrew Johnson. Confederate leaders like Longstreet came there after the war. So it was a very well-known place. Custer was there. And today, that public boat landing, there's not much left, but it once extended from Broadway to Joe Knoxall Way along the river. And the Spencer House is the ballpark's left center field today. So when you're at the ballpark watching a Reds game, think about left center field. That's where the Spencer House was, where all those famous people were. Now, let me tell you about Cincinnati and what made it so important to the Union war effort. It was the largest city in the north, west of the Appalachian Mountains. Only one other city west of the Appalachian Mountains was larger, and that's New Orleans, but that was a southern city. Cincinnati was the largest northern city. It also boasted a residency of over 161,000 people. That's small to us because of our population today, but back then that was huge. And they had many skilled laborers, mostly German and Irish skilled laborers, but as well as native-born Americans. And as a result, they were a huge manufacturing facility. In fact, Cincinnati was the 3rd largest manufacturer in the United States. 3rd. Only New York City and Philadelphia outranked it in amount of goods being produced yearly. It was huge. And that's a big, big statistic, because it's that reason why Cincinnati won the war for the West, for the Union, because it shipped most of the goods that the Union Army needed to subsist on in order to win the war. The number of folks living in Cincinnati, being the largest city in the north, west of the Appalachian Mountains, it was able to supply Cincinnati and Hamilton County residents to 590 different units: artillery, cavalry, infantry, and Navy. In fact, Cincinnati was a major naval depot during the Civil War. You say, why Cincinnati? Why were they recruiting Navy guys? I'll tell you more about that in a future slide. It also had numerous railroads, even though the river was its primary form of shipping goods and people to the south. It also had numerous very good railroads that connected itself to the south and the north. Excellent raw materials in this region. Before we deforested most of the Midwest in the late 1800s, the Midwest was known for its great forests. That's where the majority of America's wood was being harvested. We have destroyed those forests, though, since the 1890s. So forests, water, of course. Iron ore was huge. The Eastern Ohio iron ore deposits were well known throughout the world. Those supplied the iron that was needed for things like cannon and for metal sheathing on gunboats. We had coal and clay, oil. We had oil, even though oil was not a major export at that time. We did have oil in Ohio, and grains and fruit and vegetables that would be used by the soldiers, and more importantly, cattle and pigs. We were known as Porkopolis before the Civil War, one of the largest suppliers of pork in the whole United States. And pork was huge for the Union Army because they had bacon and ham typically when they went south and needed to eat some meat. That's what they had. Now, we also had, with that source of great people and the fact that by the 1860s, Cincinnati had become refined, it had also become educationally refined. And this is a great example of it. Woodward High School, alma mater of William Howard Taft. This school was the very first free high school west of the Allegheny Mountains. It was founded in 1831. Out of that school, 15 brigadier generals and 20 colonels came out of that school. And not all of them fought for the Union. Some of them fought for the Confederacy. Keep that in mind. But most of them fought for the Union. Today, as you can see, the building is a lot newer. It dates back to 1911. This is the one that I believe William Howard Taft actually laid the cornerstone because it was his alma mater. He laid the cornerstone. It dates back to 1910. And today it contains private apartments. You can live there if you want. The Eagle Iron Works was an extremely important manufacturing facility during the war because it was there that a great many of the weapons that went to the Union Army came from there. Miles Greenwood was an inventor and industrialist beyond all expectations. He changed the industrial world, in fact. He was the one who invented the very first practical steam engine for fighting fires. And he was America's first fire chief. The Cincinnati Fire Department was the very first fire department in the United States with a steam engine, in fact. And he was an industrialist. His factory churned out iron output on a constant basis. They made it into a science and not an art. They were so good at it. They were the one, they produced thousands of rifles called the Greenwood rifle, which was used a lot in the beginning of the war. He also manufactured the very first Gatling gun. That's the world's first practical machine gun. It was built right here in Cincinnati at this place. And it was so important to the Union war effort, making these weapons, that Confederate sympathizers in Cincinnati tried to burn it down 3 times. And each time failed. He was just, his place was just amazingly efficient. Today, it's the Emory Apartments that you see over here, and the old Emory Theater is built in there too. Emory Theater is, they're trying to bring it back, but it's a slow process at Walnut Street and Central Parkway. And of course, Greenwood was very hype on teaching future industrialists how to be good industrialists. So he helped found the Ohio Mechanics Institute as one of the very first beneficiaries or benefactors of the Ohio Mechanics Institute. It was founded in 1828, one of the first vocational schools in all the United States. One of those who took advantage of that industrial education was none other than Thomas Edison. He was 18 years old when he went to this place to study in the library at the Ohio Mechanics Institute. He studied electricity. And later on, he wrote that he learned most of what he learned about practical electricity at the Ohio Mechanics Institute. So we can thank the inventor of the light bulb for learning a lot of what he learned here in Cincinnati. He was in Cincinnati because he was acting as a telegraph operator in Cincinnati at the time of the war. Greenwood Hall was also in there, named after Miles Greenwood, benefactor. It served as the headquarters of the Cincinnati U.S. Sanitary Commission, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Today it's 6th and Vine Street. Of course, we all know about Procter & Gamble, right? For Cincinnatians, soap, detergent, hair care products, you name it. Back then, it was strictly soap and candles were the main exports. They also made lard oil, which was used in the making of candles. But William Procter and James Gamble built their second manufacturing location right here on Central Avenue at York Street. It's not a very good part of town today, but it's still there. The location's there. It's been built over with modern buildings. It was here, most people don't realize this. Ivory soap, the formula for Ivory soap was actually invented at this location, not at Ivory Dale. Ivory Dale was named after the fact that that's where they made it into a product that was sold to the public. And that was, Ivory Dale was formed after the Civil War. But before, they invented the formula. James N. Gamble invented it here. He came across it during his chemistry experiments. And that's where it was made in 1863, because they were trying to come up with different types of soap for the Union Army. And that's why Ivory soap was made. Now, I'll tell you, most people don't know this. If you're a Cincinnatian even, you probably don't know this. But Cincinnati was the largest manufacturer of tin-clad gunboats during the Civil War, anywhere in the United States. It was a major US Navy manufacturing center. A place called Fulton District, which is up near where Camp Clay I described to you on Riverside Drive, east of Cincinnati. The Fulton area had just been recently incorporated into the 17th Ward of Cincinnati when the war erupted. So Fulton had kind of disappeared, but it was still known as the place where all the steamboats are built. There were three major steamboat manufacturers in Cincinnati at the time the war erupted. One of them was the Marine Railway and Dry Dock. And that's how it looks today, and that's what it looked back in the Civil War there on the left. In fact, that railway was in use into the 1900s before it ran out of business. But there, 46 civilian steamboats were converted into what we call the tin clads. Those are the steamboats that were converted into gunboats, and they were called tin clads because they had a thin iron sheathing on the walls of the outside walls of the steamboats, and that allowed for cannonballs that hit it to deflect. So it was some form of protection against enemy cannonballs, and especially for bullets. But tin clads didn't do as well as the ironclads, which are more famous probably. Those are the ones that were made mainly in St. Louis and Mound City, Illinois. But even Cincinnati produced a few ironclads during this time in the Civil War, building the Brownwater Navy, Cincinnati was the birthplace of the Brownwater Navy. Those are the shallow draft gunboats that ruled the Western rivers, the Tennessee, the Cumberland River, the Mississippi River, the White River, the Ohio River, the Yazoo River. These were all controlled by the end of the war by US Navy tin clads primarily, because they had a shallower draft than say the ironclads, which often got stuck on the snags of the rivers at that time. Today, where the Marine Railway and Dry Dock stands is a warehouse at 1841 Riverside Drive. The government wagon yard. You can see a photograph from 1864 here on the left, the modern photograph there of the local firefighters union building at southwest corner of 8th and Freeman Streets downtown. That is where the old government wagon yard. Cincinnati was the largest manufacturer of wagons in the United States during the Civil War. It produced thousands, literally almost close to 8,000 wagons a year, and ambulances. To put that in perspective, one manufacturer, particularly in Cincinnati, James C.C. Holenshaw's company, produced 6,000 wagons in one single year. That's enough to supply Sherman's army during the Atlanta campaign. And Sherman's army in the Atlanta campaign was the largest US army formed west of the Appalachian Mountains up to that point in history. He had over 120,000 men on that campaign. He had 6,300 wagons supplying those 120,000 men. 6,000 of them were manufactured in Cincinnati. Pretty amazing. Cincinnati was huge when it came to that. You see an example. It's very rare to find an original Civil War wagon today, but this one's at the Atlanta History Center down in Atlanta, Georgia. It shows that wagon, what it looked like, and you see, if I do a close-up of the photograph, you can see one right there. Transportation is huge for any army to move, as well as to move civilians and politicians around during a war. You have to get from one city to another very easily. We had plenty of railroads. We had the Little Miami Railroad, which is the Loveland Bike Trail today. We had the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad, which is still active. That's the railroad that goes through Cumminsville and follows Mill Creek up to, and then goes eventually through Glendale up to Dayton. Then we had the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, which followed the Ohio River toward Indiana. And that railroad's still active today. So the Little Miami Railroad Depot stood down in Sawyer Park, where the tennis courts are today, in Sawyer Park. And that's what you see here. Abraham Lincoln boarded a Little Miami Railroad train here on February 13th, 1861, on his way to his inauguration in Washington, D.C. That would be the last time he ever saw Cincinnati. February 13th, 1861. And tens of thousands of soldiers passed through this railroad depot on their way to the Eastern campaigns. Then we had plenty of batteries. Cincinnati was so important to the Union war effort, it had to be defended from Confederate invasions or Confederate raiders. In this case, probably the most prevalent raider that would have attacked Cincinnati, in fact, he tried 4 times to threaten the city, was Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan, who I have a book about back there. He tried 4 times to threaten the city of Cincinnati because it was that important. There was one major threat in September of 1862 by Brigadier General Henry Heath, the man who started the Battle of Gettysburg. Henry Heath brought 8,000 Confederate soldiers and artillery with him and threatened Cincinnati in September of 62. And during that period, the majority of the batteries and forts that were built in northern Kentucky were built during that month and the following month. This battery here, though, was actually funded by civilians because even in 1861, Cincinnatians were really afraid that Kentuckians would rise for the Confederacy and attack Cincinnati from northern Kentucky. So they wanted forts and batteries to protect it. This was one of them, the Mount Adams Battery. And right there is where that battery stood. I say it's a private house, but it's actually Johnny Bench's wife's house. She lives where the battery stood in those days. It's right near, it's literally across the street from the Immaculata Catholic Church, the famous church that people pray on the steps during Easter time frame. Yep, Good Friday. 5,000, by the way, that was another curiosity. One Sunday were 5,000 Cincinnati civilians that came to visit the battery because they'd never seen a battery before. We had plenty of barracks around the city. One of them was, the big one was City Barracks, which stood where we have Cincinnati Music Hall today. The City Barracks, or Elm Street Barracks, were formed and to house about 2,000 men, but they ended up housing a lot more than that. In fact, just in the course of 1861 alone, there were 17,000 soldiers that billeted there. 250 Confederate prisoners were kept there too. And the famous Cincinnati Battery, known as Tilger's Battery I, 1st Ohio Light Artillery, Medal of Honor recipients out of that battery. That battery was formed right here at Music Hall. And that same view today, that's an 1864 photograph. It was the same today. So if you go to Music Hall, know that you're standing where a bunch of soldiers trained and lived and passed their time away. I do know, well, I'll tell you more about that in a second, about the hospitals, because there are plenty of hospitals in Cincinnati too, because Cincinnati had a very nice medical college, the Cincinnati College of Medicine, which was one of the earliest ones formed in the western part of the United States. And because of that, there were plenty of doctors to be had here in Cincinnati. That became important when all those sick soldiers and wounded soldiers from the southern battlefields needed help. They would ship them up by steamboat from the southern battlefields and southern camps and bring them back to Cincinnati to be treated. This was a very famous hospital in Cincinnati called the U.S. Marine Hospital. It was named after the merchant Marines that prior to the war were treated here. It had been closed by the U.S. government prior to the war. So the civilian population immediately took action when the war broke out and says, we need a hospital for soldiers. And so Cincinnatians paid their own funding through donations to bring this hospital back to life. And it was truly one of the best hospitals in Cincinnati, other than maybe Camp Dennison General Hospital. And it served as a hospital from June 28th, 1861, literally 2 months after the war started, all the way through October of 1866. It was one of the last hospitals to be closed when the war ended. Right after October 1866, it was bought by the Sisters of Charity, and they made it into Good Samaritan Hospital. It is now the median of Interstate 471, just below Mount Adams. 3rd Street Military Hospital is another one. It was attached to a barracks, and a barracks that was also used for housing soldiers in the area, called the McLean Barracks. It was originally the Convent of the Divine Will, and the US government rented it from the sisters there, the Sisters of Mercy. So this is Mercy Hospital. Beginnings of Mercy Hospital. On October 21st, 1861, it was rented from the sisters and became a hospital and barracks. And it also housed US Navy transfers all the way through August 2nd of 1865. So through the entire war and beyond. The convent building that was photographed here in 1864, that building was the military hospital, but then they converted it into a military prison about halfway through the war. Today, it's the John Street parking lot that you use to go to the Bengals game. It's literally 1 block away from Paul Brown Stadium. This is what I wanted to mention to you about another aspect of Music Hall. On the south side of Music Hall, or the south wing, was the site of the Washington Park Hospital. This was formerly known as the Orphan Asylum. It was bought by the US government from the orphanage there, and the orphans were moved to Mount Auburn. Well, when this became a hospital, it was very heavily used by the city barracks that surrounded it, as well as by other soldiers being brought into the city from the southern battlefields and camps. It was opened in February of 1862 by the US Sanitary Commission, which had its headquarters there at 6th and Vine. It treated 4,789 soldiers over the course of the war before it closed in May of 1865. When they were doing reconstruction on the south wing, they found bones, human remains. You might remember this. They found human remains under the south wing. I'm almost certain, if I were a betting man, those human remains were lost limbs that were amputated from soldiers. Because what happened typically at hospitals, they didn't deposit the limbs in any way. They usually buried them in a pit outside one of the windows or in the backyard of a house or a hospital. And that's how they handled it. So likely that's what those human remains were. They were soldiers' limbs. There was also hospitals in northern Kentucky, like the Seminary U.S. General Hospital, which was the former Western Baptist Theological Institute. It was opened during the siege of Cincinnati in September of 1862, which was that big siege I told you about, where Henry Heath tried to attack Cincinnati from northern Kentucky. Had a maximum capacity of 158 wounded soldiers and sick soldiers, closed on May 2nd, 1865, a month after the war practically ended. And then today, it's just a bunch of small businesses on Madison Avenue in Covington, Kentucky. at 11th Street. There was also a soldier's home. So, you know, we have soldiers' home, veteran homes today. They have them back in the Civil War. Well, the Cincinnati branch of the U.S. Sanitary Commission created its own soldiers' home. It was located on 3rd Street, right across the street from the Western Southern Life Garage. And it was originally Traub's Bazaar, a very famous place during the 1830s. Eventually became the Ohio Mechanics Institute before it moved to the other location I had showed you. In just the course from May 1862 through April 1865, in the course of that period, 112,000 soldiers were taken care of there. So that soldiers' home was very busy, very, very busy. The Great Western Sanitary Fair was a major event in Cincinnati. It was set up by the Cincinnati branch of the U.S. Sanitary Commission to raise funds for soldiers, to be used for soldiers' supplies and bandages and such. It successfully raised a 3-week event, $235,000, which is roughly $4.1 million in today's money. They built 2 bazaars, huge buildings where they had displays and you could buy crafts and other items that were being donated. And one of them was on Government Square, right there in front of the federal building downtown on 5th Street. Then Mozart Hall was part of that same event. That's currently the Huntington Bank on Fountain Square. It was used in the exhibit hall and it was eventually became the last provost marshal's office of Cincinnati in 1865 before it closed on December 19th of that year. Entertainment was important. So you got to keep your civilians happy during the war, including your soldiers who come back home for leave. And Pike's Opera House was one of the big places you would go. That's where they had the grand burlesque events. They had famous speakers go there and speak patriotic speeches, as well as give patriotic talks or poems. In this case, one of the most famous talks that occurred here was in 1864 when Thomas B. Reed wrote, after he wrote Sheridan's Ride, the first reading of that famous poem was done here at Pike's Opera House. Today, it's the Cincinnati Regional Chamber on 3 East 4th Street. I told you about the Siege of Cincinnati a little bit. General Lew Wallace, who wrote Ben-Hur after the war, he was commander of Cincinnati at the time of the siege, and he was considered the savior of Cincinnati. From General Henry Heath, who brought 8,000 Confederates up to possibly capture Cincinnati. But if you read Henry Heath's words about it after the war, he says, I didn't plan to capture Cincinnati, I just planned to threaten it. Well, what happened in reality was General Lew Wallace brought in all these thousands of soldiers from all across Indiana and Ohio that didn't know how to fire a gun. Most of them only knew how to hunt. And they brought their squirrel rifles with them and their pistols from the War of 1812. And they were known as the squirrel hunters. Thousands of them came in. And they built a special pontoon bridge, the very first bridge of the Ohio River at Cincinnati, just to get these men from Cincinnati over to northern Kentucky to defend the hills from Henry Heath. It was designed by a Cincinnati architect, Wesley Cameron, and he used barges that he brought in from the Licking River to place these planks across and build this huge pontoon bridge. It was a great success. It was dismantled in November of 1862, and that's the site of it there. It's at the end of Walnut Street on the Cincinnati side, and it's at Riverside Place on Covington side. Then also these same squirrel hunters, because they couldn't really shoot and they probably would run at the first fight, they were used instead, they used their muscle to build all these entrenchments, 8 miles of entrenchments, batteries, forts. Eventually, there would be enough forts to cover the span of the northern neck of the Ohio River, which is from Bromley, Kentucky over to Fort Thomas. Modern Fort Thomas. Back then it wasn't called Fort Thomas. And that line of defenses proved very useful. When Henry Heath arrived on September 10th and he saw these thousands of troops behind these entrenchments, he said, it's not worth it. It's not worth to attack it. I'm just here to act as a diversion anyway. So he immediately turned tail the next day, and Cincinnati was saved without a shot. Another time when Cincinnati was threatened was Morgan's Great Raid, which I wrote a whole book about. They came through around northern Hamilton County on the night of July 13th and 14th of 1863. The main event that occurred during that night, because it was a night ride, very little happened until the morning of July 14th, when one of Morgan's subordinates, Colonel Basil Duke, who commanded a brigade in Morgan's division, was asked to keep the attention of Camp Dennison and keep those troops that are in Camp Dennison from coming out and attacking the rest of his division. Colonel Duke did that well, but they ended up having a skirmish because of that. And Union Lieutenant Colonel George W. Neff was the commander of the camp, and he was afraid that Morgan would try to burn it. It was, as I mentioned, it is the largest camp in the state of Ohio, one of the most important camps in all of the Union. To have Morgan burn that would be a huge black spot on the Union cause. So Neff lived up to his expectations. He did it very well. He defended the camp in the fight at the Little Miami Railroad Bridge, which is the Loveland Bike Trail Bridge over the Little Miami River at Miamiville. That's where it occurred. And there's some markers there to describe it. That occurred on July 14th. It was a 3-hour skirmish. And Neff personally led a bayonet charge across that bridge during the end part of the fight. And that's what decided the fight in favor of the Union soldiers there. And he led 200 militiamen initially, but he took 20 convalescents across that bridge. Convalescents are soldiers who were sent back from those southern battlefields to recuperate from either a terrible sickness or from a wound. He found 20 that were able to walk and fire a gun, and he used them in this fight. It was one of the few instances during the Civil War where convalescents were used in a skirmish with Confederate troops. So Neff successfully did this, and this is a view of the same bridge, and shows the fight there, and Neff leading those convalescents across the railroad bridge. And this is what it looks like today. There's a modern highway bridge there. State Route 126 crosses right next to it. That bridge was not there at the time of the war. There was also the quartermaster. The quartermaster is huge in Cincinnati. This was the headquarters. You might recognize it because you see the red stadium in the background there on the right side. The two buildings here, right here, are original to the Civil War. They're these two buildings. The actual quartermaster department headquarters was this building, which is right here. It's at Hammond Street and Sycamore Street. There is one place, though, in northern Kentucky from the quartermaster's department still stands. It was the James Blick warehouse that U.S. Quartermaster Department started renting in 1863. And it contained the office of the Covington Post Quartermaster. It still stands today. It is the Madison South Event Center today. And if you look closely, not on this picture, but if you go there today, it's at 8th and Madison Avenue. You'll see the original bricked up entryway, and this window is also bricked up. It's still visible today. In Cincinnati, we have one building left from the quartermaster department. It stands today right here. That's a FedEx office right there with the purple awning. It was built in 1850. This is a picture of it in 1864. It was used for holding harness for horses. There were plenty of other barracks in the city, like Lytle Barracks, named after William Lytle, one of the heroes of Cincinnati. He was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga. This particular place held 700 men and officers. It's on Harriet Street at Mering Way on the west side of Cincinnati. And there's a picture of General William Lytle. And then we have Garrichet Barracks, same thing, named after a Union soldier who had died during the war. Colonel Julius P. Garrichet is well known as the man who was killed by decapitation during the Battle of Stones River. His head was taken off by a cannonball as he was riding next to General William S. Rosecrans, commander of the Army of the Cumberland. And he was a Cuban immigrant who fought for the Union. And his brother, Father Garrichet, was the president of Xavier University at the time. It was called Xavier College, and Xavier College sat right next to St. Xavier Church down on Sycamore Street at 6th and Sycamore. There he is, picture of Colonel Julius Garrichet. Besides all the clothing that Cincinnati produced for the Union Army, it also produced lots of tents. There was a tent factory that stood right where the Hamilton County Justice Center sits today, down next to the courthouse. Almost 300,000 tents were produced in Cincinnati during the war. Inspection warehouse, you had to inspect all these things before they shipped to the Union Army to the South. This was a very important building for that purpose. You'll notice that's the Freedom Center down at the banks. Cincinnati's Quartermaster Depot was the most active quartermaster depot in the West. It dispensed over the course of the war 346,000 coats, 1.47 million trousers for the soldiers, 2.35 million shirts for soldiers, 5 million stockings, and 1.3 million canteens, and on and on and on. That's enough to supply an army of over 110,000 men for 5 years. And that's the size of Sherman's army in 1864 when he went to take Atlanta. That was the largest Union army ever put on federal soil during the Civil War west of the Appalachian Mountains. So the Cincinnati Depot had a major impact on the Civil War. The Burnett House, I told you, was the place to stay. Famous people here, like President Abraham Lincoln, came here on his inaugural journey. He stood out on the porch right here and gave a speech to the citizens saying, "Thanks for electing me." The London Times called it the finest hotel in the world. At the time it was built in 1850. General Grant and General Sherman came here in 1864 to plan the Atlanta campaign here. So the beginning of the end of the Confederacy was started here. They also discussed Grant's campaign called the Overland Campaign, which was from May of 1864. It was discussed in the same hotel. So you might recognize this because it's at 3rd and Vine, because the original hotel was torn down in 1926, but when they built this new building, they kept a lot of the same elements. You'll see some of the same architectural elements in this building here, which is it's a complex, it's an apartment complex, very exclusive apartment complex, and also a place to park your car. It's called City Club Apartments, for those who know downtown pretty well. And then you have, General Grant and General Sherman, whom I just talked about. They weren't Cincinnati boys, but they came to Cincinnati quite a bit for many other reasons. And that's why I listed them here. And finally, I wanted to mention one more place before we end our talk tonight, and that's 5th Street Market House, the center of all social activity in Cincinnati at the time of the Civil War. There's no doubt if there's one building in all of Cincinnati that had the most importance to the city, it was the 5th Street Market House. It was there that there would be political demonstrations. It was there after the firing of Fort Sumter that thousands of people would gather and talk about, let's become Union soldiers. Let's join Abraham Lincoln's army. It was there that they fed those Union soldiers when they were recruited, or they came in from other cities or even other states. They would come through Cincinnati to get on those steamboats. It was here that the civilians fed them for free. The passion of the Cincinnatian was tremendous. how much they helped the Union war effort. I told you at the beginning of this talk how no one knew where Cincinnatians would go. Would they side for the South or the North? There is no doubt Cincinnati was a pro-Union city, and they showed it throughout the war, even re-electing Abraham Lincoln in 1864. And so the Fifth Street Market House was a place where they celebrated the end of the war when Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9th, 1865. Several days later, they had a huge celebration here. It was the night of April 14th, 1865. And you know what happened on that night? That's when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in Washington, D.C. It was that same night they had this giant celebration. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people came out. They had fireworks at the Fifth Street Market House. They had bonfires, they had parades. It was a huge celebration, lots of flags, just huge. But shortly after Lincoln was assassinated, the whole city became a sheet of black as the city shrouded itself in mourning. Yet another casualty to that great war that we still remember today. That place where the Fifth Street Market House is Fountain Square. It was torn down when the Tyler Davidson Fountain was erected in 1870. So when you walk, you see those trees here in the middle, that's where the market house was right there. And so when you go by there at Fountain Square, when there's a great celebration down there or political rally, just remember that's where the Cincinnatians did it in the Civil War too. And so we were all following in their path. After our 150 years, we're still going down there to do what we do best, to love ourselves and talk with ourselves. And I finish up with a picture of a house that still stands, and that is Harriet Beecher Stowe's house, one of the great people that helped bring African Americans into the fold. Thank you very much.
How about a few questions? David, are you good?
Yes.
For a few questions? Anybody have any questions that they would like to ask our guest tonight? Right here. Hold tight. If we need the microphone.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nita, and I have a question. You said in your presentation that Cincinnati had a lot of skilled workers. I'm curious what were considered skilled workers then? Were they like the machinists or the clockmakers, the shoemakers? Is that what was considered skilled?
That is correct. So these would be people that would own their own businesses, that would know how to run a machine, that would know how to brew beer, that would know how to build furniture. And that's what made Cincinnati so important, is because they had thousands and thousands of skilled workers, mainly the Germans who had immigrated there in the 1840s and 1850s. The Irish and African Americans that lived in the city were considered the unskilled workers. They would work on the docks. They would be doing the dirty jobs. They would do hair cutting, they would do street cleaning and such.
Other questions?
I had heard that Abraham Lincoln did ride that train on the Loveland Trail to Camp Edison. And somebody said he stopped at what today is the Schoolhouse Restaurant.
Yeah, that is a falsehood. So
Is it?
he did take the train along the Little Miami Railroad through Camp Dennison, but Camp Dennison had not been formed yet, because if you recall, it wasn't formed until April 27th, 1861, which is in my presentation there. He came through there on February of 1861, several months earlier. So the camp didn't even exist. And that schoolhouse restaurant did not exist in the Civil War.
I thought it was being built during the Civil War.
It was built in 1865.
Oh, it was.
Yes. Yep.
Other questions for our speaker?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Keith. What about some of the dissenters of the time, like the editors of the Cincinnati Enquirer, James Barron and Washington McLean or Clement Vallandigham? I mean, there certainly were Cincinnatians who weren't big supporters of the war. What about those fellows?
Yeah, that's definitely a population of Democrats, particularly, who did not like the Republican Party and what they stood for. Clement Vallandigham, you mentioned, is from Dayton. He was a representative there from Dayton. He often gave speeches in Cincinnati. He was considered a Copperhead or Southern sympathizer. He preached the idea of compromise between the Confederacy and the Union to bring the war to a close that way. Unionists in Cincinnati hated him so much. So the majority of Cincinnatians did not side with him. There were a lot of Democrats in Cincinnati, don't get me wrong. You can tell that from the 1864 election, how many Democrats there were. The Republicans barely won the 1864 election in Cincinnati, but that's because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, keep in mind, Cincinnatians were still a divided city when it came to politics, but they were all unionists. They were 98% unionists. Preserve the Union, number one. But when it came to slavery, they were heavily divided. And when the Emancipation Proclamation came into being, it really made a lot of Cincinnatians angry. And they tried to show that in the 1863 or 1864 election. But Clement Vallandigham ran for governor of Ohio in 1863, October of 63, and he lost big time. He ran in absentia. He was actually in Canada when he ran his political campaign because he had been banished by Abraham Lincoln to the South.
Excuse me, sir. I'm sorry. Do you know how well in the election of 1860, how Cincinnati voted?
Yes.
Overall, because the Lytle family and the Pendleton family were, obviously big forces in Cincinnati at the time.
Yeah, I have the exact percentages in my book, but I do remember one percentage. Lincoln received 46% of the vote in Cincinnati. This is strictly Cincinnati voters. He won 46% of the Cincinnati voters. The others were split between the Southern and Northern Democrats. You have John C. Breckinridge, did not win very many votes. He was the Southern Democrat. The Northern Democrat was Stephen Douglas from Illinois, from Chicago. He won the majority of the Democratic vote, but still it wasn't close to what Lincoln won.
Here's another question.
Hi, my name is Katie. You didn't mention him, but I wondered, I've read about a General Cook who was here in Cincinnati. I just wondered if you had any references to him.
General Cook, that name does not sound familiar to me at all. Do you remember what he did specifically? Was it Hooker maybe you're referring to? Might be Crook. Yeah, it could be Crook. General Crook was from the Ohio region. He wasn't from Cincinnati, but he was from the Ohio region. He was in Cincinnati a few times.
David, we have a question online in the back.
Okay.
We have a online participant wondering, were there any water battles that took place in the Cincinnati area?
There were no water battles in the Cincinnati area. We had two major skirmishes on land. One was the skirmish I showed you on the presentation at Camp Dennison at the Little Miami River Bridge. And the other skirmish occurred in what is the Kroger's there at Fort Mitchell.
My name's Greg. I'm a Procter & Gamble retiree. I've always had the impression that Procter & Gamble did a lot of business during the Civil War.
Yes.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, Procter & Gamble did a huge business in the Civil War. In fact, that's what made them very wealthy. Procter & Gamble had a small candle and soap business before the war. But the fact is they knew the war was coming and they did something really smart. They bought the main chemical that's used in soap. It comes from, it's a resin. I think it's called rosin or something like that. And it came from trees from the South. They bought most of this resin from New Orleans. Well, they kind of saw it coming. They saw this war that could come and could separate New Orleans away from Cincinnati, which it did. No longer could Cincinnati trade, and after May of 1861, it could no longer trade with the South. So that resin was basically you couldn't buy it anywhere if you were a soap maker. But they had stocked up on it for years prior to the Civil War. And so they had this huge stockpile of this resin. And that's why the government gave them the contract, because they said, well, I've got all the resin, my competitors don't. We can make the soap for you and get you through this war. And sure enough, they did. The number of candles they made for the Union Army are staggering. Supplied the Union Army for years. in candles.
Last question right here.
Jeff, you had mentioned that Irish Catholics, a lot of them enlisted following the Bishop Purcell.
Yes.
What about the German Catholics? Were they more Democrats or?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So the Irish Catholics were primarily Republican. The German Catholics were primarily Democrats, and were actually the ones that tended to be more of Copperheads, Southern sympathizers. It's the German Protestants that came out in thousands to join the Union Army. And that's a kind of an interesting thing, because you think that most of the Germans over the Rhine area were Catholic, but they weren't. Most of them were actually Reformed Protestant faiths. And a lot of them had come over during the 1848 wars that were occurring in Prussia at the time, and had emigrated to Cincinnati, and they brought their faith with them. And that's why they felt so strongly against slavery too, is because they felt that they had been wronged by the Prussian government over there, and they felt oppressed. And then, of course, the Know Nothing movement in the United States, they weren't really well welcomed in Cincinnati. So Germans were heavily persecuted in Cincinnati. That's why they've concentrated in over the Rhine, because they had to separate themselves from the Irish and the native-born Americans, because they hated their guts. They all hated each other. They all fought for the same jobs too. And economics is always at the root of all hatred, believe me. You boil it down, prejudice, racism, all starts with economics. And it breeds in human relations. And that's what happened with the Germans. They were heavily persecuted by other races within the Cincinnati area.
Let's thank our guest tonight.
Thank you.
What a great class. What fun. What fun to see all those locations that we're gonna visit. I wanted to let everybody know online, Renee W., you're the winner of David's book, Morgan's Great Raid. Make sure to pick up a copy of David's book on your way out. We hope to see you Tuesday for Made to Last and Joe Blystone, and then we sure hope to see you Thursday at the Third Eye Brewing Company. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
I loved it.
Thank you.
Procter & Gamble's.